Hi, I'm Amy Schlusser. I'm the Senior Clean Energy Policy Analyst for the Oregon Department of Energy. And today I am here to talk to you about Oregon's clean energy transition. First, for those of you that may not be familiar with the Oregon Department of Energy, we are the state's dedicated energy agency. And our mission is to help Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for future and current generations. So today I am going to, as I mentioned, talk about the clean energy transition in Oregon. So I'm going to start by giving some background and context into the current electricity landscape in Oregon. Where does our electricity come from, essentially? Then I'm going to give some just framing around Oregon's clean energy transition. And then I'm going to describe some of the key policies and incentives that Oregon has adopted to help the state transition to renewable electricity. And then I'm going to briefly introduce the Oregon Department of Energy, or ODO's, work to develop a state energy strategy to inform the clean energy transition in Oregon. Okay, so this pie chart shows how the electricity that was used in Oregon in 2020 was produced. So as you can see from the big gray and red slices of the pie, the majority of Oregon's energy was produced from fossil fuels, natural gas and coal. Hydropower came in a close second, and as far as a single resource goes, hydropower was the greatest contributor to Oregon's electricity mix in 2020. Less than 10% of the state's electricity was produced from renewable energy sources like wind and solar. But the previous slide showed Oregon's electricity mix as a whole, but the specific mix of resources that are used to generate the electricity used in a specific building, like the building we're in right now, can differ dramatically depending on the utility that's serving the building. So right now, the electricity that we're using is coming from Portland General Electric, or PGE, which is our state's largest investor-owned electric utility. So these pie charts show PGE and Pacific Power's, our second largest investor-owned utilities, electric mixes in 2020. And as you can see, PGE got most of its electricity from natural gas. Can you all hear me okay? I feel like. And then it also purchased a lot of electricity on the open market, which I will explain in a little bit more detail later. And then Pacific Power, our state's second largest investor-owned utility, got most of its electricity from coal in 2020. So Oregon, most of the electricity users in Oregon get their electricity from an investor-owned utility, but not all. So we also have many consumer-owned utilities in the state that primarily serve towns or rural areas, and they tend to be smaller. Our largest consumer-owned utility is the Eugene Water and Electric Board, or EWEB. And so the chart on the far right shows the composite of all consumer-owned utilities' electricity mixes in 2020. The vast majority of the electricity that consumer-owned utilities sell to consumers is they purchase from Bonneville Power Administration, or BPA. And so that's the pie chart on the far left. And Bonneville Power Administration gets most of its power from the federal Columbia River system hydropower facilities, the big dams on the Columbia River. And then I also added EWEB in there just in case any of you are from Eugene and were curious about what your electricity mix looks like. But so in general, consumer-owned utilities get their power from BPA, and then they serve their remaining demand by purchasing electricity through the market. So in 2020, this shows where the electricity that was purchased in the market, or how the electricity purchased through the market was produced. Now, so when I say market, that it doesn't actually mean like a broad market. You can't go to like a energy version of a supermarket to go and buy electricity in Oregon. There are many parts of the United States that do have regional electricity markets where you can just buy and sell electricity from anyone that's participating at any time. We don't have that in the Northwest right now. So instead, when we say market purchases, what we're talking about are bilateral transactions for the exchange of electricity between parties, typically from one utility to another utility. So in Oregon in 2020, most of the electricity purchased through those market purchases was produced from coal-fired power plants. And then the second largest source of market purchases was hydropower. Oregon also doesn't produce all of the electricity that we use in the state, and we don't use all of the electricity that we produce in the state either. So this slide compares the amount of electricity that we produce from different resources with the amount of electricity that we consume from different resources. And so you can see the bar on the left that says coal. We import the vast majority of our coal-fired power. And actually now, so this is from 2020, and in 2020, Oregon's only coal-fired power plant was retired. So now we import all of the electricity that we use that's produced from coal. In contrast, we actually export power that we produce from hydroelectric dams and from natural gas-fired power plants. So we produce more power from those resources than we need in the state, so we export it to other states. And then finally, this shows the change in Oregon's electricity resource mix from 2012 to 2020. And I think this slide is interesting because it shows that while we did increase the amount of electricity that we consumed overall from 2012 to 2020, the composition of that electricity resource mix didn't change that much. The amount of power that we used that was produced from hydroelectric dams and the amount of coal-fired power we produced stayed pretty constant from 2012 to 2020. We also increased the amount of power that we were using from natural gas-fired power plants. And then at the very top, you can see that we also slightly increased the amount of wind power and solar power that we used in 2020. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk about the clean energy transition that's currently underway in Oregon. So as Ricky noted, when we use the term clean energy transition, what we're talking about is a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. So in the context of my presentation, when I say the clean energy transition, I'm really focusing on the transition from coal and natural gas-fired power to clean and renewable sources of electricity. So to understand why Oregon is in the midst of a clean energy transition, you need to take a step back to the early 2000s, when the Oregon legislature became increasingly aware of and concerned by the impacts of climate change from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. Anthropogenic means man-made emissions of greenhouse gases. So this slide shows Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions by sector from 1990 to 2019. And as you can see in the slide, while there has been some fluctuation in our emissions over the past couple decades, we haven't reduced our emissions. And our emissions, so our emissions in 2019 and in 2020, if this slide continued, are higher than our emissions were in 1990. So in an effort to mitigate Oregon's contributions to global climate change, in 2007, the Oregon legislature adopted greenhouse gas reduction goals for the state that were based on the best available science at the time. They adopted two targets, a near-term target and a long-term target. The near-term target called for the state to reduce its emissions to 10% below 1990 levels by 2020. That goal is depicted with the yellow line at the top of the graph, and we did not meet that goal. Our long-term goal that the legislature adopted in 2007 was to reduce our statewide emissions by at least 75% below 1990 levels by 2050. And that goal is depicted by the bright green line at the bottom of this slide. In order to meet that goal, we will have to dramatically reduce our emissions over the next 20 years. The majority of Oregon's emissions come from two sectors: the transportation sector, which is shown in the dark band on the bottom of the graph, and the electricity sector, which is the bright green band on the map, or on the graph. So in order to meet our 2050 greenhouse gas reduction goals, we need to dramatically shrink that bright green band of emissions. And we can do that by replacing fossil fuel-fired electricity with renewable electricity. From a production standpoint, it is far cheaper to produce electricity from renewable resources like wind and the sun than it is to generate power from fossil fuels, because you have no fuel costs. The sun and the wind are free. But in order to transition from fossil fuel-fired power plants to renewable resources, you have to build new energy resources. And those energy resources have upfront costs, and they require new investments. And at the same time, we also need to phase out the electricity that we're producing from fossil fuel-fired power plants that already exist. In many cases, they've already been entirely paid for. In some cases, we're still paying for them. But in either case, they provide a steady source of revenue for their utility owners. So given those constraints, the Oregon legislature recognized that the state was unlikely to achieve a clean energy transition on its own within the time frame necessary to reach our greenhouse gas reduction goals. So the legislature adopted a series of policies to support a transition to clean and renewable energy. And some of these key policies include our Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, a 100% clean energy standard that was established by HB 2021, some community-based renewable energy programs, and some financial incentives. And I'm going to talk about each of these policies in a little bit more detail. I'm also going to talk about some previous policies and programs that the state had in effect that helped to get us to where we are now in terms of renewable energy deployment, but that aren't in effect anymore. The Oregon legislature adopted the state's Renewable Portfolio Standards, or RPS, in 2007, the same year that it adopted the greenhouse gas reduction goals. An RPS is a renewable energy procurement standard that requires a percentage of the electricity sold to Oregon customers to be produced from qualifying renewable energy sources. In Oregon, we have several renewable portfolio standards that are different for different types of utilities. I'm just going to focus on the large investor-owned utility standards right now. So large investor-owned utilities, PGE and Pacific Power, have to provide 50% renewable power to their customers by 2040. And the standard ramps up over time. It's currently 20%, so 20% of the power they sell must come from qualifying renewable energy resources. And then the standard will ramp up to 27% in 2025. Not all energy sources that would be considered clean and renewable qualify for Oregon's RPS. The resources that qualify include solar, wind, geothermal, which is the picture on the bottom right of the slide, biomass, which is the picture on the top right of the slide, and then also wave, tidal, and ocean thermal energy, as well as certified low-impact hydropower and efficiency upgrades at existing hydropower facilities. The large legacy hydropower, like the big dams in the Columbia River, do not qualify for Oregon's RPS by themselves. And the utilities are required to demonstrate compliance with the RPS by surrendering what are known as renewable energy certificates, or RECs. And RECs are a marketable certificate that can be traded, like bought and sold between parties across the West. So they don't have to be, our utilities can buy RECs from utilities in other states, so long as those RECs were produced by renewable energy resources that are certified in Oregon under our RPS. And utilities can also bank their RECs for a certain amount of time. So right now, our large investor-owned utilities are sitting on fairly large bank accounts of renewable energy certificates that they can use for compliance in future years. So 2 years ago, the Oregon legislature adopted HB 2021. And this was a landmark bill in Oregon. It not only set one of the fastest timelines for transitioning to emissions-free electricity in the country. It requires 100% of our electricity to be clean by 2040 for most of the state's electricity. And it also centers communities of color and rural communities and coastal communities and low-income communities in the clean energy transition. So HB 2021 established 100% clean electricity standards for the state's largest investor-owned utilities, PGE and Pacific Power. And like the RPS, these standards ramp up over time. 80% of the electricity sold by these utilities must be clean by 2030, 90% clean by 2035, and 100% clean by 2040. But in contrast to the RPS, which is a renewable energy procurement standard, HB 2021's 100% clean standard is actually a greenhouse gas emission standards. So when I say that 100% of their electricity has to be clean by 2040, what this really means is that the greenhouse gas emissions from their electricity mix must be 100% lower than their baseline greenhouse gas emissions from their electricity mixes. And I believe the baseline was set, I think it's an average of 2010 to 2012 emissions, but I could be mixing up my baselines. So each year, the utilities are required to report their greenhouse gas emissions to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and those reports will be used to determine compliance with HB 2021. Because HB 2021 set emission standards rather than procurement standards, utilities can rely on any combination of resources to comply so long as those resources reduce their total emissions. So, for example, energy efficiency could help them achieve their HB 2021 targets. So could nuclear power or legacy hydropower. Oregon has also adopted several policies to support community-based renewable energy development in Oregon. And these are projects that either provide power to local communities or are owned by local communities or provide other co-benefits to local communities in the state. So the first of these policies is a community-based renewable energy target. This target requires that by 2030, utilities that serve more than 25,000 Oregon customers must ensure that 10% of their electricity generating capacity is provided by small-scale renewable energy projects. And these are projects that are 20 megawatts and under. So that's actually a fairly large project. It's just not a huge, massive utility scale project. Oregon also has a community renewable energy project grant program. And this is a competitive grant program that's administered by the Oregon Department of Energy. Local governments, tribes, and consumer-owned utilities can apply for grants of up to $1 million for community renewable energy projects. Eligible projects include renewable energy systems like solar or wind power, or energy storage systems, and microgrid technologies that are paired with new renewable energy systems. And that grant program also has a a sub-program that provides grants for planning to develop community-based renewable energy projects. And then finally, Oregon has a community solar program. This program is administered by the Energy Trust of Oregon, Community Energy Project, and Energy Solutions, and it's overseen by the Oregon Public Utility Commission. The program enables residential and business customers of PGE, Pacific Power, and Idaho Power, which is another investor-owned utility that operates in far eastern Oregon. It enables their customers to subscribe to a local community solar project and receive credits on their monthly utility bills. Oregon also has a variety of state incentives available to help offset the upfront costs of renewable energy systems, and there are federal incentives available as well. So first, Oregon has a solar plus storage rebate program, and this is a program that's also administered by the Oregon Department of Energy, and it provides rebates to homeowners and low-income service providers to invest in solar electric systems and systems that pair solar PV with energy storage. The rebate values for homeowners differ depending on the homeowner's income and their access to incentives from other sources from their utilities. But in all cases, the maximum incentive available is $5,000. Low-income service providers are Oregon-based organizations that serve low and moderate income households, so including entities like multifamily housing developers, community service organizations, or local or tribal governments. And the rebates available to low-income service providers can total up to $30,000 for a solar electric system and up to $15,000 for an energy storage system. The Energy Trust of Oregon also offers cash incentives for renewable energy projects that are installed by customers of Oregon's investor-owned utilities, so PGE, Pacific Power, and Idaho Power. And then there are federal incentives available. The Inflation Reduction Act included $369 billion in climate and energy funding, and it included and reinstated several clean energy tax credit programs, including the residential clean energy tax credit, the clean energy production tax credit, and the clean energy investment tax credit. I'm not going to go into any detail about these credits, but I'm happy to provide more information if anyone's interested. And then finally, the Inflation Reduction Act established a program that is known as Solar for All, and that program provides competitive grant funding to support increased access to solar energy in disadvantaged communities and low-income households. And a coalition known as the Oregon Solar for All Coalition, which is led by the Oregon Department of Energy, submitted an application for $138 million in grant funding, and we're still waiting to find out if we will receive that grant or not. Oregon also, the Oregon legislature also previously adopted a series of financial incentives that have either sunset or they've exhausted their available funding. These policies aren't in effect anymore, but they played a really important role in building Oregon's renewable energy sector and supporting early renewable energy development in the state. And these programs included 2 energy tax credits, the residential energy tax credit and the business energy tax credit. These are commonly referred to as the RETC and the BETC. The RETC provided tax credits to nearly 600,000 Oregonians, and the business energy tax credit, which was administered by the Oregon Department of Energy and sunset in 2014, provided more than $1 billion in tax credits over the course of its program. It was first adopted in 1979, so that was a pretty long period of time, but $1 billion is a lot of money. We also previously had a renewable energy development grant program that awarded over $9 million for renewable energy projects. And we had a small-scale energy loan program that issued loans totaling more than $600 million since the program's launch in 1980. So taken together, Oregon's clean energy policies are projected to significantly contribute to greenhouse gas reductions over the next few decades. This wedge diagram is from the Oregon Global Warming Commission's TIGGR analysis. I cannot ever remember what TIGGR stands for. Transformational something greenhouse gas emissions reductions. This wedge chart shows the projected emissions reductions from all of the clean energy policies that are in effect in Oregon today. The blue wedge at the top depicts the estimated emissions reductions from HB 2021's 100% clean energy standard. And the blue bar effectively also incorporates Oregon's RPS because RPS certified resources can be used towards compliance with HB 2021. So for our 2022 biennial energy report, the Oregon Department of Energy reviewed multiple studies to determine what it would take to achieve our clean energy targets, meaning what will it take to actually transition to 100% clean energy by 2040. And our assessment concluded that there are multiple pathways available to achieve these targets, and each pathway presents unique opportunities, challenges, and trade-offs. So the department concluded that Oregon would benefit from a statewide energy strategy that evaluates available pathways, balances trade-offs, and aligns policy and equity goals. So in the 2023 legislative session, the legislature adopted HB 3630, which directed the Oregon Department of Energy to develop a comprehensive state energy strategy that's informed by robust stakeholder engagement and technical analysis, and identifies optimized pathways to achieve Oregon's clean energy goals. The Oregon Department of Energy is in the early stages of developing this strategy, and if you'd like to learn more about the Oregon Energy Strategy or sign up for email updates on the process, please visit the link that's on this slide. And finally, I've also provided just a list of other resources for those of you that want to learn more about any of the policies that I talked about today. The Oregon Department of Energy's website is a really great resource, and I'm happy to share these slides, so I believe they'll be available on the website. And my email address is also on the title slide, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
Before you leave the stage, does anyone have any questions? I actually have a mic today for you, so.
I was curious about the hydro. You mentioned that the Columbia River, the legacy dams aren't, included. And I was wondering, is there any modifications that could happen to those that they could be included sometime because it's, there's so much infrastructure there?
Yes, that's a great question. So while the dams themselves, the power that comes out of the dams, like the legacy dams, the dams that have been in existence for many, many decades, doesn't qualify for the RPS. But if efficiency upgrades are made to the dams, and those efficiency upgrades enable the dams to produce more power from the same amount of flow, then that additional amount of power that's attributed to those efficiency upgrades is eligible for the Oregon RPS. And we do have several efficiency upgrades at hydroelectric facilities certified in Oregon that are participating in the RPS now. Yeah, the intent of the RPS was to incentivize new renewable energy development, so that's why the existing hydropower facilities weren't eligible, but they also wanted to incentivize improvements at the dams, so that's why the efficiency upgrades are eligible.
I had a question about I forget the term, but the coupons that
the rebates?
No.
Oh, RECs, renewable energy certificates.
Yes, that is the one. So I was listening to you talk about that, and I know for, if you're building a new Connex Auto Parts and you have to mitigate a wetland, like you can buy a sponsorship for a wetland that's actually happening somewhere. Are these RECs kind of the same thing, like there is actual real carbon that's remaining sequestered and not being released into the atmosphere, and these RECs represent that? Or is it just kind of a, coconut game where, oh, okay, we're buying these coupons and there's, nothing's really happening and we're still barreling down the road to climate change? That's my question.
This is a great question, and it's actually it can get pretty complicated with all the different certificates that are available out there. So RECs are different from carbon offset credits, which are the credits that you can buy that will indicate, that are supposed to indicate that a metric ton of carbon has been sequestered and stored or has been prevented from being emitted. Renewable energy certificates don't actually have any connection to carbon directly. What a renewable energy certificate signifies is that 1 megawatt hour of electricity has been produced from a renewable resource. And the reason why we use these instruments is because the electricity system is much like, it operates pretty similarly to like a water pipeline, where you have a lot of inputs, but once electricity gets into the transmission network, you can't distinguish between different molecules or different electrons of electricity. You can't tell how they were produced. And so the idea of renewable energy certificates was that if you input 1 megawatt hour of electricity onto the grid, and you take 1 megawatt hour of electricity out of the grid, as long as you have that certificate, you can say that the electricity that you are pulling out of the grid was produced from a renewable resource. So that's the basis for why RECs exist. Now, under programs like the Renewable Portfolio Standard, RECs are used as compliance instruments. And so it's a little bit different than putting electricity in and pulling it out, because you can bank these certificates for a period of time. But in general, they indicate that a certain amount of renewable energy was produced and consumed at a certain period of time. Now, under the compliance frameworks, so many states have renewable portfolio standards. So there's one entity, it's called REGIS, and it's operated by the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, and they take care of all the RECs. They issue all the RECs. They approve them. They manage the REC bank accounts for different utilities. And so utilities can trade those RECs back and forth. Like they can purchase them and sell them. But in general, because they're used for compliance with state policies, they're pretty expensive. So they're not usually used in like voluntary markets. We also have voluntary REC markets that operate alongside these compliance markets. And that's where it gets a little bit kind of wishy-washy, because anybody can go and buy a REC that says that a megawatt hour of renewable energy was produced and put into the grid, but you don't know where that was produced, and you don't know if that power was actually really used or not. So those RECs tend to be a lot cheaper, but they also don't necessarily indicate that the same benefits were produced from the electricity that are associated with the REC.
Hi. I got a quick question. It's a two-part question. First of all, when you talked about phasing out natural gas, did that exclude natural gas created by waste management facilities, biogas? And the second part of the question, is there any incentives for waste management facilities to create biogas infrastructure?
Yes, that's a great question. So the answer to your question is yes and yes. So the 100% clean energy standard applies to natural gas produced, like fossil natural gas. But electricity that's produced from biogas, like biogas collected from a waste facility, that's eligible for the Oregon RPS. So it's actually more valuable than if a utility used nuclear power to comply with HB 2021, because generally speaking, electricity that qualifies under the RPS is worth more money because it has this REC associated with it that has value. So yes, so there are incentives to collect biogas and use it to generate electricity.
Hi, I was wondering, in regard to the Oregon energy strategy moving forward, how the tribes are involved with that process.
That is a great question. So we are very, very committed to engaging with the tribes. We're also required by statute to engage with the tribes in the production of the Oregon energy strategy. So we have notified all the tribes of the process. We are meeting with them individually and really trying to determine how they want to engage, because not all tribes are different and not all tribes have the capacity to attend, dozens of meetings. And so we're really putting the tribes in the driver's seat to determine how they want to engage, and then we are adapting our engagement practices around what the tribes want. So I don't have a clear answer because this is an ongoing process, but yes, we are very engaged with the tribes, and it's really just seeing what they want.